Hello! Hopefully this works. Are we working? Hope so. All right, let's see. Well, we're starting a little later. A few minutes. And what I prefer, like to be on a little before start time. Talk to some peeps. Well, let's see. What do we got here? Free stream. Looking good. Looks like we got free stream, or Twitter's up. And we got Twitch. And YouTube. And Kick. All right. Hello. So, I'm going to pause the tunes. As we approach Donald J. Trump's inauguration on Monday, I find myself very concerned for what I see. It's not usually something I ever really step into, but I don't know what's coming Monday. And I'm going to be very honest. Here's what I'm going to use as my measuring stick. So this right here is a picture of my son who passed away a few years ago. This is an older picture from a happy time with my son and granddaughter. I have a total of 7 grandchildren. And this person right here, my granddaughter, as well as my children and my grandchildren, are my tribe. Makes sense, right? Okay. So that's pretty easy to figure out. If this, let's take a look at something else here. Let's look at another picture. Where's that picture? Give me a minute. I'll find it. It'll be worth the juice. Will be worth the squeeze. I guarantee. As soon as I find it. Okay, there we go. So this picture is a picture of Donald Trump's granddaughter, Carolyn Dorothy Trump. So pretty sure that's Donald Trump's in crowd. There's mine. There's Donald J. Trump's. Right there. That's his granddaughter. So, with what's coming Monday. Oh, hang on. You can't see that. Let's go live. So, as I was saying, this is a picture of Carolyn Dorothy Trump, one of the grandchildren of Donald Trump. Here is my grandchild. Right? Makes sense. My grandchild, Donald Trump's grandchild. So there's some pretty stark differences. But the essential question is my granddaughter's life worth less than Donald J. Trump's granddaughter? I don't think so. Is anyone's granddaughter, any American granddaughter, worth less than Donald J. Trump's? I don't think so. That's not my view of the world. And then if we add in things like, oh, I don't know, this child right here, is this grandchild worth any less than Donald J. Trump's grandchild? I don't think so. How do you weigh that value? I mean, I know in some minds, ooh, Donald J. Trump, he's special. He's special. Special dude. So we should do what he says. Well, he thinks he's special, but has a lot more to do with how he started and what he got handed. And it's a lot more than what you might think. So we're going to explore some very, very old ideas. How old? Predate the Bible. We're going back to Aristotle. Because I know it may come as a shock, but we have done this shit before. Way, way too many times. So, we're going to go and check out some vids about how to fix it. So, here we go. And, we'll stop at any point. Anyone has any questions? Just shout them out. This video, here, let's go and zoom in. What Aristotle knew about oligarchy that we forgot. This is by Legendary Lore. We're going to see 3 videos. The first one talks about oligarchy. Then the second one is about how we can use those weak points and the actual solution. We got ideas about them all. So, without any further ado, let's check it out. Oh, I'm gonna turn off my my sign here because I don't want to be accused of having my sign during their video. But please support.
Imagine a society.
Oh, hang on. Let's throw that link in the chat so you can certainly go and support the author of this content. We stand, as always, on the backs of legends.
Imagine a society
Here
where
we
the
go.
wealthiest few don't just influence laws, they write them. Where they don't just benefit from policies, they create them. Where state power isn't just swayed by wealth, it's wielded by it. Sounds familiar? Well, Over 2,300 years ago, in his great work Politics, Aristotle identified a system of government he called oligarchy, rule by the wealthy few. Based on his studies of history and politics, he described how this system arises, how it maintains power, and why it's inherently unstable. As you read Aristotle's description of oligarchy, you might start to recognize some unsettling parallels to your own society today. From the concentration of wealth to the influence of money in politics, Aristotle's ancient insights in many ways feel eerily modern. So in the next few minutes, we'll break down Aristotle's blueprint of oligarchy, perhaps uncovering how its ancient patterns may still occasionally echo in the corridors of power today. To understand Aristotle's view of oligarchy, we first need to understand his categories of regime types. In his typical systematic approach, Aristotle identified 6 distinct types of government, divided into 2 categories. There are the true forms and their perverted counterparts. Within the 3 true forms, we have monarchy first. In its ideal form, the monarch would be virtuous and govern for the common good. Next is aristocracy, which is ruled by a select few. For Aristotle, these aren't just the wealthy or the well-born, but the aristos, meaning the best, most virtuous, and most capable members of society. The third true form is what Aristotle called polity, sometimes translated as constitutional government. This is a mixed system, blending elements of democracy and oligarchy, but with a strong legal basis that prevents any powerful group from abusing the others. Now, for each of these, Aristotle identified a corresponding perverted form, a government that shares similarities with its true counterpart, but has deviated from the path of virtue and common good. Monarchy's corrupt twin is tyranny, as I presented in a previous video, and democracy is seen by Aristotle as the perverted form of polity. It's ruled by the masses, but without the legal limits of the polity, where decisions are driven by the majority's desires rather than the common good. For Aristotle, this often leads to demagoguery, instability, and the erosion of justice. And finally, we come to oligarchy. As Aristotle notes, the poor and the rich fight with each other, and whichever side wins doesn't set up a fair or popular government. Instead, they see political power as their prize for winning, and one side sets up democracy, while the other sets up an oligarchy. Remember, aristocracy is ruled by the aristos, or the best. Oligarchy, on the other hand, is a perversion of this ideal. In an oligarchy, focus shifts from the welfare of the community to the interests of the rulers themselves. It's no longer about who is most capable or most dedicated to the common good, but about who has the most money or property. In aristocracy, leaders are chosen based on their ability to govern well and their commitment to the public interest. In oligarchy, the path to power is paved with gold, and the purpose of rule becomes the preservation and expansion of the ruler's wealth and influence. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's a gradual process from usually polity, democracy, or aristocracy, and often subtle at first. Perhaps wealth starts as just one factor among many in selecting leaders, but over time, it becomes the dominant or even sole criterion. Or maybe virtuous leaders slowly begin to prioritize their own interests over those of the community. Aristotle noted that oligarchies, like tyrannies, are forms of government where power is used to benefit those in control rather than the broader community. So both systems are self-serving, but while tyranny is ruled by one person and his close circle, an oligarchy is ruled by a few more individuals. But more importantly, tyrants often rely on military force, whereas oligarchs first and foremost gain and maintain their power through their wealth. This is sometimes written into the law, but often it's just based on informal influence, which leads to laws and policies that favor the wealthy. The main point is that power is kept within the wealthy few, either through high property qualifications for holding office, or by making the process of running for office too expensive for most people. This financial control allows them to operate within existing legal and political systems, manipulating these systems to suit their needs. This gives oligarchies an appearance of legitimacy, making them seem more stable than tyrannies, but Aristotle still considered them unstable at their core. Oligarchs are skilled at using their political power to protect and grow their wealth. They might pass laws that give them lucrative government contracts, protect business monopolies, or create regulations that limit competition. These tactics can sometimes lead to supreme oligarchy, where the wealthy have unchecked power and ignore any appearance of cultural or constitutional limits. In these cases, Decisions are made solely for the benefit of the ruling elite rather than for the good of society. This disregard for the common good is another trait that oligarchies share with tyrannies, making them similarly dangerous to a state's stability. Also, like tyrants, oligarchs tend to distrust the general population. They might disarm the common people and hire foreign mercenaries to guard against potential uprisings. This reflects their very real fear of losing control, leading them to keep the poor at bay, sometimes even pushing them out of cities by making urban living too expensive, or taking more direct measures to maintain their grip on power. Aristotle pointed out that oligarchy isn't a single uniform system, but rather a spectrum with different types. On one end, there are extreme forms where only the very richest have power. In other forms, a small, powerful minority controls the government, and while it might seem open to those with modest wealth, it remains firmly in the hands of a gatekeeping inner circle. So how do these oligarchies come to power? Aristotle explained that it often starts with a gradual shift. A small group of people begin to accumulate more wealth, which in turn allows them to gain more political influence. As their power grows, they shape policies and institutions in ways that further increase their wealth, creating a cycle where wealth leads to power and power leads to more wealth. A system that seems democratic or aristocratic can start to slide into oligarchy without most people noticing. Over time, certain signs become clearer. The wealthiest begin to control all key government roles and institutions. Merit and ability become less important than wealth for gaining leadership positions. And the idea that economic inequality also justifies political inequality becomes more accepted. Once an oligarchy is established, the people in power often leads to a decline in public virtue, where personal gain takes priority over the common good among all members of society. At this point, you might be wondering how these ancient insights apply to the world around us. While Aristotle was examining the city-states of ancient Greece, his observations on oligarchy were remarkably astute and perhaps relevant to a few other societies throughout history. Let's consider some signs that might indicate the presence of oligarchic tendencies. First, look at laws and regulations that benefit the wealthy at the expense of the general populace or society at large. This isn't always obvious. It might be hidden in complex tax codes or subtle regulatory structures. Imagine, for instance, a tax code that allows owners of luxury yachts to claim significant deductions while providing no comparable options for ordinary citizens. Next, examine economic policies. Do they tend to increase concentration of wealth? Aristotle noted that oligarchies use their power to further enrich themselves. Consider a hypothetical society where the government consistently bails out large corporations, which hits the general population with inflation, higher taxes, and reduced public services. Over time, this could lead to increased wealth concentration. Another key indicator is access to political office. In a true oligarchy, only the wealthy can realistically attain positions of power. As mentioned, this might not be an explicit law, but picture a hypothetical political system where running for office requires millions in personal funds or backing from wealthy donors. This effectively restricts political participation to the rich or those supported by the rich. Related to this is the question of who has genuine access to lawmakers and regulators. In an oligarchic system, the wealthy few have the ear of those in power, while ordinary citizens struggle to make their voices heard. Imagine a scenario where industry leaders regularly hold private meetings with lawmakers and powerful bureaucrats to discuss policy, while requests for meetings from ordinary citizens and smaller organizations are usually denied or ignored. Also look for a so-called revolving door between government and the private sector. If you see a constant flow of individuals moving between positions of political power and high-level corporate roles, that might indicate the kind of close alliance between wealth and governance that Aristotle associated with oligarchy. Picture a situation where a high-ranking official in the finance ministry leaves his post for a lucrative position in a major bank, or a former minister getting hired in a corporation within his former portfolio. Social mobility is another crucial factor. Aristotle understood that oligarchies work to maintain class distinctions. Consider a hypothetical society where the cost of education has skyrocketed to the point where only the children of wealthy families can attend universities without incurring crippling debt, thereby limiting opportunities for advancement for those from less affluent backgrounds. Remember, Aristotle didn't see these as isolated factors, but as symptoms of a political system that prioritizes the interests of the wealthy few over the common good. No society perfectly fits any single model of governance, and elements that might appear oligarchic could exist within various other political systems. The key is to look at the overall pattern and to consider how political and economic power are distributed and used. The good news is that Aristotle found oligarchies to be inherently unstable, second only to tyrannies in their short lifespan. The bad news is that they are often replaced by another perverted form of government. He recognized that political regimes fall for many reasons, but he saw revolt as a primary cause, particularly in oligarchies. One interesting observation he made was about the introduction of new cultural or ethnic groups into an existing political community. He argued that this could be a significant source of instability and conflict, especially if these groups don't quickly develop a shared sense of identity or common purpose with the existing population. Internal conflict among the oligarchs themselves is another major factor. This could be a situation where a small group within the oligarchy becomes greedy and attempts to monopolize all the offices of power. Aristotle noted that his hyper-concentration of power often leads to resentment and conflict within the ruling class, destabilizing the entire system. Perhaps the most significant threat to oligarchies, in Aristotle's view, comes from popular revolt against state-sanctioned oppression. The constant tension between the rich and the poor creates a powder keg of social unrest. He also noted the role of populist leaders. These figures would emerge and capitalize on the people's discontent by promising reforms. While this will sometimes lead to one of the three so-called true regime types, Aristotle observed that they often result in a new oligarchy or even tyranny. Another fascinating insight from Aristotle concerns the generational aspect of oligarchic decline. He said that the children of oligarchs, raised in luxury and comfort, tend to become degenerate and weak over time. Meanwhile, the children of the poor are hardened by their difficult circumstances and become tough. This disparity equips the poor to rebel successfully against their rulers. As we wrap up, Aristotle's analysis of oligarchy provides us with some timeless insights into the dynamics of wealth and power in governance. From the gradual rise of oligarchic rule to the tactics used by the wealthy few to maintain their grip on power, these ancient observations may, perhaps, maybe, resonate a bit in our modern world. I'd love to hear your perspective. Are there parallels you can draw to your own society? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you found this exploration valuable, please consider joining our Patreon. Supporters get access to audio-only versions of our videos, and your support is crucial in our mission to bring these timeless ideas to a wider audience. Thank you for watching.
Okay. All right. That was the first video. We can go unless there's any questions or comments. I'll go to the next video here, which is why oligarchy falls and how to speed it up. And this is by Legendary Lore. There you go. I'll throw that video into there, in the chat. And we'll go ahead here and take a look.
But they can't control everything forever.
Oops. Let's go back.
They control the wealth, they control the laws, and they control the system, but they can't control everything forever. In our previous exploration of oligarchy, Aristotle uncovered how the wealthy few don't just influence society, but shape its very foundations. That video resonated with over 1 million people across the entire political spectrum from every corner of the world. Why? Because based on the comment section, they felt this is happening in their own nations. A few powerful people controlling not just wealth, but the fundamental rules that govern our lives. But there's something we didn't cover in that video. Hidden in Aristotle's politics lies something more. His writing did not just reveal how oligarchies work. He also discovered something that should make every tyrant and oligarch nervous. These systems that seem invincible often follow patterns of decline, and when they appear strongest, when their control seems absolute, that's often when they're most vulnerable. Aristotle mapped out when and how these moments of vulnerability emerge. What makes some attempts at change succeed while others fail? And most crucially, how to ensure that when change comes, it leads to one of the so-called true regime forms, rather than something even worse. So I thought it'd be interesting to break down Aristotle's implied blueprint for ending oligarchies. We'll discover how to recognize these critical moments of opportunity, why timing matters more than strength, and most importantly, how to avoid the traps that have doomed many attempts at change. Change is coming. It always does. The question isn't if, but when, what comes next, and how to impact that. First, let's remind ourselves that Aristotle wasn't theorizing about political change from some abstract position. He tutored powerful leaders like Alexander the Great, and he studied over 150 different Greek city-states and foreign regimes. As both a philosopher and an empirical observer, he noticed patterns repeating throughout history, and these patterns reveal something valuable about how power changes hands. Many feel that the best, no, the only way to end an oppressive regime is through open revolution, but Aristotle found something much more complex. When studying countless political transformations, he noticed that the most aggressive revolutions often produce the worst outcomes. Take Syracuse under Dionysius. The dramatic overthrow led by Dion promised liberation, but ultimately created an even more oppressive system. The revolutionary had rallied the people with visions of freedom, only to deliver another form of tyranny. And we've seen many such cases in recent history too. This is why Aristotle advocated for gradual reform rather than violent upheaval. In politics, he writes that changes in government should not be attempted at once, but rather by small degrees, warning that those who lead a successful revolution will gain all the power of the state for themselves. For Aristotle, the continued stability of the political system was essential, not just for order's sake, but because stable systems allowed for the kind of incremental improvements that could enhance citizens' lives without risking catastrophic collapse. Most of the successful political transformations he studied were ones where people barely realized they were happening until they were done. But that perspective presents a significant issue, because this led him to focus mostly on gradual top-down reforms by those already within the spheres of power. But what if you're not part of the ruling class, or even ruling class adjacent? Of course, you could attempt to become a reforming part of the oligarchy yourself, which is not necessarily a bad strategy. But when that's not possible, what are you supposed to do then? Just wait and hope for benevolent reforms from above? This is where we need to go a bit beyond what Aristotle explicitly said by reading somewhat between the lines while still adhering to his analysis. During his studies, Aristotle noticed something curious about power. He saw that political systems tended to move through distinct phases, each with their own characteristics and vulnerabilities. What he observed was subtle but important. Political systems don't just change randomly, but they're not mechanically predictable either. Instead, they tend to face specific types of decay that can be reversed or accelerated by human action. For example, a monarchy turns into a tyranny when the ruler starts prioritizing self-interest over the common good. A polity risks degradation to democracy when it caters to the immediate desires of the masses rather than the long-term good of society. And an aristocracy often drifts toward oligarchy when the elite become consumed by greed rather than merit and virtue. Aristotle argued that these corrupted forms of government are even less stable than their good counterparts because they are fundamentally unjust. Tyrannies are inherently fragile because they rely on force and lack the support of the people. Over time, the ruler's abuses lead to resistance, rebellion, or assassination. And democracies are almost as unstable because they lack the guiding principles of justice and virtue. This reveals a crucial pattern. What those in power do to make their power absolute often end up making it more fragile. When they silence opposition, they isolate themselves and lose vital feedback about what's happening in society. When they hoard wealth, they create resentment and alternative power centers, and when they eliminate rivals, they destroy the very institutions that could help stabilize their rule. While dismantling institutions may provide short-term control, it removes the foundations for sustainable governance, leaving the regime vulnerable to collapse or external threats. And that leads to an exciting revelation. If political systems tend to face predictable challenges, and if certain actions create specific weaknesses in that system, then that allows us to identify when a corrupt system is vulnerable to change. And perhaps even more importantly, you can recognize what kind of actions are more likely to succeed at different moments. This isn't deterministic prophecy, of course, but Aristotle saw these tendencies play out again and again, and while no two situations are identical, the underlying dynamics of power, how it concentrates, how it corrupts, and how it potentially transforms, do follow recognizable patterns. And it's these patterns we need to understand if we want to see how and when change becomes possible. And just like all the other regime types, oligarchies have their own life cycles and fragilities. Think about how wealth becomes political power. It starts subtly. A few successful individuals or families begin shaping things in their favor. Maybe it's through campaign contributions, media ownership, or funding think tanks. They don't usually stage a coup. Instead, they play a longer game. Year by year, they indirectly shape tax policies, regulations, and market rules until their advantages become self-reinforcing. Their wealth buys influence, and that influence helps them accumulate more wealth. Then comes the consolidation phase. The rules themselves begin to transform. What started as informal influence gets encoded into law. Think about how seemingly neutral technical adjustments to campaign rules, corporate structures, tax frameworks, and so on slowly reshape the playing field. Each change appears small and sometimes even reasonable in isolation. A tweak here, an adjustment there. But step back and look at the whole picture. These individual changes form an architecture of power, each piece reinforcing the others. But over time, these regimes enter what we could call a degeneration phase. Think about what happens when any group or individual becomes too comfortable in a position of power. At first, they try to justify their privileges, their job creators. They do it for the people, they are saving the economy, think of the children, and so on. But gradually something shifts. The justifications become thinner, more perfunctory. Eventually, they stop bothering to justify at all. Public resources become their personal piggy bank, public institutions their private toolset, and public concerns are barely worth acknowledging. This is exactly when they look strongest on the surface. They've got everything under their control. The money, the power, the institutions. Look at how the 30 tyrants controlled Athens. They had all the weapons, all the wealth, total formal authority. They thought they were showing strength by ruthlessly eliminating critics, hoarding wealth, and crushing dissent. Yet they were creating the perfect conditions for their own overthrow. What makes this pattern so important is how it reveals the paradox of power, strength becoming weakness, control breeding its own instability. When those in charge respond to challenges by becoming more controlling, they often accelerate their own decline. Their harsh policies alienate potential allies. Their visible excesses create silent resentment. Their internal rivalries fracture their unity. Think of it like holding sand. The tighter you squeeze, the more it slips through your fingers. The more they crush dissent, the more they create the conditions for their own undoing. They lose touch with reality, lose critical feedback, lose the legitimate authority that originally let them govern. It's not that they become weak. They still have all the surface power, but they become brittle. And that brittleness, more than any external enemy, is what ultimately threatens their rule. But perhaps most importantly for those watching closely, this pattern reveals moments of opportunity for the oppressed. Because understanding these phases is not just about predicting decline, it's about recognizing opportunities. Each phase has its own vulnerabilities, its own pressure points, and its own possibilities for transformation. And this brings us to the crucial question. How do you recognize when a system is entering its vulnerable phases? What subtle signs signal that change might be possible? Because, as Aristotle observed, timing often matters more than strength. So how do we know when change is nigh for oligarchy specifically? Aristotle observed several critical indicators that often converge to create what we could call a perfect storm. The first sign is perhaps the most obvious, yet often misunderstood. When public dissatisfaction flares up, it's not really the volume of complaints that matters, it's their nature. The oligarchs can handle protests against a new tax on farmland. They can manage complaints about inflation, and they love when isolated issues like minimum wages or subsidies release some pent-up steam. But Aristotle observed that while a state can handle many types of protests, the real danger comes when people stop believing the state serves its proper end, the good life and virtue of its citizens. So, when protests shift from specific grievances to fundamental questions of justice, not just is this fair, but is our whole system serving its purpose, that's when things are about to boil over. This total erosion of legitimacy typically happens in three distinct but interconnected ways. First, while Aristotle recognized the importance of private property, he warned against the wealthy treating common things as their own, like when public spaces become effectively private, when shared infrastructure serves only elite interests, when common goods like water and, in our times, airwaves and digital networks become de facto personal property of the economic political class. Second, Aristotle was particularly concerned when the laws and customs that the oligarchs themselves established start being ignored whenever convenient. They impose austerity on the masses while they themselves live in luxury. They praise competition until they need to crush rivals. They talk about innovation while blocking new ideas that might threaten their position. As Aristotle noted, this hypocrisy undermines the very foundation of law, which should apply equally to all. Third, and perhaps most fundamentally, when rulers become disconnected from the virtues and values they're supposed to exemplify. Aristotle believed that legitimate rule required not just wealth or power, but moral excellence. If oligarchs from their isolated positions push radical social transformations while being entirely disconnected from their impacts on ordinary communities, if they advocate for fundamental changes to how people live, work, and raise their children, all while being insulated from the consequences of these changes, they hold in contempt the very cultural traditions and social bonds that most communities consider essential to their way of life. The gap becomes no longer just economic, but moral and cultural. This triple erosion of public resources, of rules for thee, not for me, and of shared cultural values creates a fundamental crisis of legitimacy. But the thing is, Aristotle observed that public dissatisfaction alone rarely triggers change. What makes a moment truly critical is when it combines with internal division among the ruling class itself. While studying different city-states, he noticed that oligarchies often fall not from external pressure, but from disputes among those in power. For example, between different business interests, preventing them from presenting a united front. When oligarchs start infighting over market regulations or resource control, they create openings they'd never allow if united. And the final crucial sign of changing winds is the emergence of new leaders and voices, but not always where you'd expect. The crucial voices often don't come from traditional opposition. They come from entrepreneurs who've built independent economic power, from respected professionals who've stayed above factional disputes, and from people who can bridge different social classes and interest groups. Crucially, Aristotle observed that change leading to a more just system, rather than change to some other oligarchy or tyranny, must involve the middle class. Positive change has to come through those who occupy a middle position between extremes of wealth and poverty, those who have enough property to be independent, but not so much as to be corrupted by luxury. What makes the middle class effective is their ability to combine virtue with practical wisdom. They aren't typically the most radical voices calling for revolution, nor are they part of the established oligarchy. Instead, they are ordinary people who understand both what is good and what is possible, a combination Aristotle saw as essential for any meaningful political change. Most importantly, leaders representing the middle class succeed because they understand what Aristotle considered the true purpose of the state. Not just stability or wealth, but the good life that comes through the practice of virtue. So how does this help us understand when and how to act? Interpreting Aristotle's observations suggests a few crucial approaches. First, build alternative sources of power. They don't need to, and probably shouldn't, be direct confrontations with oligarchic authority. Instead, focus on creating independent economic networks, developing new technologies, or establishing cultural institutions that operate outside traditional power structures. Think of it as building a parallel system rather than directly confronting the existing one. This is exactly what emerging merchant classes did in many Greek cities, gradually accumulating influence through trade networks that the traditional power base couldn't control as easily. Second, form intentional coalitions, but not the kind you might imagine. Successful challenges to entrenched power rarely come from single interest groups. Instead, effective transformations happen when different people find common cause. Consider how in many Greek city-states, the emerging commercial class often allied with small farmers against the traditional landed upper class. Today, this could, for example, mean bringing together tech innovators frustrated by monopolistic practices, traditional businesses, and middle-class citizens seeking economic stability and a normal life. Third, understand and exploit system weaknesses. When oligarchies abuse their power, they create openings. Think about it this way. Every time oligarchs break their own stated principles, they create what we might call legitimacy gaps, or a discrepancy between the expectations of how leaders should act and how they actually act. The key is matching your response to their specific contradictions. When they champion meritocracy while practicing nepotism, document and publicize clear cases of unearned privilege. When they compromise courts, utilize dispute resolution systems. When they preach free markets but practice monopoly, rally the natural coalition of small business owners crushed by unfair competition and consumers tired of inflated prices. Your responses should not only challenge existing power, but demonstrate a better way forward. Turn their contradictions into stepping stones toward positive change. Each of these compensating moves creates new vulnerabilities, new contradictions, and new potential points of leverage. As Archimedes said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world." Fourth, and this is crucial, develop political virtue. It's not just about personal morality, it's about building the capacity for effective action. An oligarchy's greatest weakness often lies in its inability to generate genuine loyalty or collective purpose. They rule through power rather than legitimate authority. Your advantage is the ability to create genuine communities of interest and purpose. Last but perhaps most important, cultivate what we might call strategic patience. It's easy to swallow the proverbial black pill when things seem hopeless. But remember, oligarchies often appear strongest just before they begin to crack. Their very efforts to maintain absolute control frequently generate the conditions for their own transformation. Thank you for watching.
Cool. So, that was the blueprint of how to do it. Excuse me. And here's the idea, the third part of where we could go. Of course, remember 2,300 years ago, this is Aristotle's ideas. So you see how around long this crap's been around? Whoa. All right, here we go.
Democracy is a disaster waiting to happen. This system of government that's celebrated worldwide as the pinnacle of human political achievement is fundamentally flawed. And I'm not talking about minor issues. I'm talking about a fatal defect that tears societies apart. Now, before you rush to the comment section, note that this isn't the opinion of some guy on the internet. This comes from one of the greatest minds in human history, Aristotle. Over 2,300 years ago, one of the greatest philosophers in history identified a fundamental weakness in democracy, a flaw he thought was so significant that it will eventually undermine the very foundations of any democracy anywhere. Of course, Aristotle being Aristotle, he didn't just criticize democracy, he also offered a solution, a system that, while not his ideal form of government, would address the problems with democracy and ensure stability and a better life for its citizens. So in the next few minutes, we're going to dive deep into Aristotle's world. We'll first touch on the central flaw he found in democracy, which we have already addressed in another video, but our main focus will be on his proposed solution. We'll also take this proposed solution and catapult it into the 21st century. Consider a modern nation built on these principles. What would it look like? How would it function? And would you want to live in a society like that? But first, let's take a moment to appreciate the depth of his knowledge. Aristotle's political journey began with Plato, a mentor he respected but often disagreed with. Perhaps you too have had that one teacher who pushed you to question everything through passionate disagreement. For me, it was my high school economics teacher. For Aristotle, it was Plato. But Aristotle's quest for understanding took him far beyond the classroom. After Plato's death, he became tutor to future leaders, including Alexander the Great, Ptolemy I, and Cassander. After Alexander became king, Aristotle returned to Athens to found his own school. Here, he also embarked on an ambitious project of studying 158 different Greek city-states. All his experience and studying culminated in multiple great works, including Politics, which is a summary of his political thoughts that would shape Western thinking for literally thousands of years. In Politics, Aristotle identified three main types of government that he further divided into a so-called true form and a perverted version, a classification that is still just as relevant today as it was back then. First, there's rule by one individual. In its true form, we have monarchy, where a single leader governs for the common good. Think of a visionary king working tirelessly for his people. But power can corrupt, and the perverted form of monarchy is tyranny, where the ruler and his inner circle act for their own personal benefit, like a dictator who treats the nation's resources like his personal piggy bank. Then there's rule by a select few. Its true form is aristocracy, which is ruled by the most virtuous and capable citizens for the benefit of society, like a board of directors chosen for their expertise and integrity. But when wealth becomes the only qualifier, we get its perverted form, oligarchy, where the rich few control the state for their own interests, not entirely unlike how some would argue big corporations shape politics today. And then there's rule by the many, which sounds great on paper, but Aristotle considered democracy to be the perverted form of this type of government, where a majority rules in its own interest at the expense of the long-term well-being of society. But what exactly did Aristotle see as the significant problem with democracy? To understand this, we need to consider how democracy works, at least in its purest form. In a true democracy, everyone gets a vote, and the majority wins. You might be thinking, but isn't that the beauty of democracy? What's the problem? You see, Aristotle realized that in a system where the majority always wins, there's a real danger of the majority abusing its power. He was particularly concerned about the poor using their numerical advantage to, essentially, redistribute wealth through excessive taxation or property redistribution. But the problem goes deeper than that. It's not just about rich versus poor. The real issue is that anyone who can gather sufficient support can hold power, regardless of whether they're virtuous, competent, or acting in the best long-term interests of the nation. This leads to a whole host of problems. For one thing, there's a potential disregard for the rule of law. If the majority can simply vote to change any laws whenever they want, it could lead to a system where legal protections become unstable and subject to the whims of popular opinion. A related issue is the risk of demagoguery triumphing over competence. Skilled orators who can sway the masses might gain power, even if they're not the best qualified to lead. In Aristotle's words, where laws aren't in control, demagogues pop up. The people become like a monarch, a single composite entity made up of many individuals. When the people are like this, they become despotic. This could result in charismatic but incompetent leaders taking the reins of government, prioritizing popularity over effective governance. Short-term thinking is also a significant concern in democracy. In a system where leaders are constantly seeking re-election, policies might be enacted based on what's popular right now, rather than what's best for the long-term health of society. This myopic approach to governance could lead to decisions that feel good in the moment but cause problems down the line, potentially jeopardizing the future stability and prosperity of the nation. And finally, there's the risk of severe conflict and instability. In a democracy where the majority consistently imposes its will, minority groups will feel perpetually mistreated. This will lead to resentment and a desire to seize power by any means necessary. As these groups fight for control, society could be torn apart by constant strife. The result is a volatile political environment where different factions are in a constant struggle for dominance. In other words, the central problem with democracy is what we would call tyranny of the majority. It's the idea that in a pure democracy, the political majority can oppress the minority just as surely as any tyrant would. Now, I understand what you might be thinking, but don't we have safeguards against this in modern democracies? And you're correct, we do. But those safeguards are not part of democracy. They're additions or modifications to the system, and in a way, they prove Aristotle's point, that pure democracy, on its own, is flawed. Of course, he didn't just identify a problem and leave it for others to fix. This is Aristotle we're discussing after all. He would relentlessly follow a line of thought to the end, so he proposed a solution that he believed could solve this flaw. But before we get to the proposed solution, allow me to quickly preface with an important context. Aristotle's ideal form of government was monarchy. Yes, one of the foundational thinkers of Western civilization believed that, in the best-case scenario, rule by a single, exceptionally virtuous and wise individual was superior to rule by the many. But the key word here is best-case scenario. Aristotle wasn't advocating for the kind of absolute monarchy we think of today. He imagined a monarch who would act more as a guide, promoting a system where laws and institutions worked for the benefit of all, and where the king should be subservient to the law. And this is important to note, while he did prefer monarchy under an exceptionally virtuous ruler, he recognized its rarity in practice. So, what did Aristotle propose as a more realistic fix to a democracy in decline? Remember how he talked about a perverted and a true version of each system of government, where democracy was among the perverted regime forms. His solution was its true counterpart, a system he called polity. Polity, which is often translated as constitutional government, is Aristotle's attempt to create a more balanced mix by taking the best parts of democracy and oligarchy and combining them into something better. Now you might be thinking, wait a moment, didn't you just make a video on how oligarchy was problematic? And you're right to be skeptical. At first glance, this might seem like a recipe for disaster. How could two opposing systems possibly work together? Not to mention that both are placed in the perverted category. But here's where Aristotle's creativity shines through. He realized that each system had strengths that could balance out the other's weaknesses. Based on this insight, he conceived of polity as a solution to create a better form of government. Let's start with the democratic ingredients. Democracy gives us personal freedom and the right to have a say in how we're governed, which is desirable. But he also noticed the critical flaw of majority tyranny, which leads to chaos, with endless infighting and decisions based on popularity rather than wisdom. Oligarchy, on the other hand, is efficient at making decisions and tends to put skilled people in charge. It's also good at thinking long-term and protecting private property. But, and it's a big but, oligarchy is essentially unfair and ignores the needs of ordinary people. So Aristotle selected the beneficial aspects of oligarchy to complement the democratic elements in polity. In polity, leaders are chosen based on merit, not just popularity. This sounds a lot like oligarchy, but the crucial difference is that these leaders are still accountable to the people, just like in a democracy. The point is to have experts making the decisions, but with the people holding the power to fire them if they mess up. Additionally, polity encourages civic involvement, much like a democracy. Everyone has a stake in the government, but it also embraces the oligarchic idea of stability with less frequent changes in leadership. Think about it. An engaged populace working with a stable government that can plan for the long term. It's like combining the energy of a town hall meeting with the strategic planning of a successful corporation. But there is also one crucial element in Aristotle's vision that exists in neither pure democracy nor oligarchy. A strong fundamental law that stands above day-to-day politics. This is what we would call a constitution today. As Aristotle wrote, the law should rule supreme, with officials deciding about particulars. Without this stable legal foundation, even the best system will eventually drift towards despotism of one type or the other. Having a solid, well-thought-through law act as a safeguard against the whims of rulers or the passions of the majority ensures, at least in theory, that the central values of society will remain intact. Okay, so we've summarized most of what sounds like a clever way to balance different interests in society. But there is one final point to be made. For Aristotle, there was one crucial element that tied it all together, the middle class. In Aristotle's polity, it's not the rich or the poor who hold the reins of power, it's those in the middle. Modern Westerners would argue that everyone should have equal say in politics, but Aristotle believed that a strong, large middle class was key to political stability and good governance. He argued that the middle class has sufficient wealth to prefer a stable society, but not so much that they're out of touch with common people or the poor. They're not desperate enough to support radical redistribution of wealth, but they're also not inclined to use state power to prop up business monopolies, and they are generally too busy with their own lives and small businesses to creating unnecessary projects and regulations just to serve the bureaucratic class. Okay, so now you might be thinking that this sounds like interesting theory, a system that combines the positive parts of democracy and oligarchy, led by a strong middle class, following established laws and procedures. But no country today really embodies Aristotle's ideal polity. So, let's do a thought experiment. What if Aristotle was suddenly brought back to life and tasked with fixing the political system of a modern society in a way that still maintained many democratic elements? What would this society look like? First and foremost, our Aristotelian nation would have a rock-solid constitution. This document would form the backbone of the entire political system. It would clearly define the rights of citizens and probably draw on several parts of the US Bill of Rights, including the Second Amendment. It would also define the rules for how laws are made and enforced, and the structure of government. That government structure would probably be a two-part legislative system, somewhat akin to a less democratic version of the United States Congress. You'd have one chamber representing the common people, elected by popular vote. But you'd also have a second chamber representing the wealthier and the educated, with members chosen based on property qualifications or professional expertise, and who would be able to veto laws. This might sound elitist, but the goal here is balance. The idea is to have a system where the interests of all parts of society are represented and must work together to pass laws. In this Aristotelian polity, voting rights wouldn't be universal. Instead, they'd be restricted to citizens who meet specific criteria. Those could be related to age, property ownership, military service, having children, or perhaps a suffrage tests. The point isn't explicitly to exclude people, but to ensure that voters have a stake in society, as well as the knowledge and experience to make informed decisions. A historical example, though far from a perfect one, was the Rhodesian voting system. Rhodesia had what was called an A roll and a B roll system. To qualify for the more politically influential A roll, citizens of any race needed to meet certain income and property requirements. However, even those with relatively low incomes could qualify if they had a primary education. Unlike an oligarchy, the A roll wasn't limited to the super wealthy, but included the middle class and educated individuals. Of course, this system operated within an ethnically heterogeneous society, which had very different consequences than Aristotle's assumptions of a homogeneous population, but it does offer a glimpse of how a tiered voting system based on economic and educational qualifications might function in practice. I can anticipate the objections, but remember, this is about preventing the tyranny of the majority that Aristotle feared. The goal is to have voters who have skin in the game, who are invested in the long-term health of their society, rather than personal short-term interests. And here's an important point. This Aristotelian state wouldn't just leave people to fend for themselves. There would be policies in place to prevent extreme wealth disparities, for example, progressive taxation or limits on inheritance. The purpose would be to support the poor and maintain a large and stable middle class, preventing any single person or dynasty from becoming too powerful. In terms of national defense, this would be handled primarily by well-armed citizen militias. Property-owning citizens would be expected to serve, creating a link between military service and political influence. The professional military would be kept small to prevent it from dominating politics, and the emphasis would be on ensuring that those defending the state have a genuine stake in its survival. This would create a strong sense of civic duty and shared responsibility, as military service is both an obligation and a privilege of citizenship. But perhaps the most crucial aspect of this Aristotelian state would be its emphasis on education. And we're not just talking about basic literacy and numeracy here. We're talking about comprehensive civic and moral education. The state would invest heavily in teaching citizens about their rights and responsibilities, about ethics and virtue. The goal would be to create a populace that's not just literate, but truly engaged in civic life. Citizens who understand the complexities of governance and can make informed decisions. Citizens who respect property rights but don't put profit above all else. And speaking of informed decisions, our Aristotelian state would probably have strict rules against demagoguery. Political campaigns would be regulated to prevent leaders from gaining power through empty populist rhetoric. Instead, politicians would be required by the state and the voters to justify their policies based on reason and evidence. To prevent the development of a permanent political class, there would be term limits and mandatory rotation of officials. The idea being to encourage broader participation across all of society and prevent any one group from entrenching itself in the halls of power. Now, I understand that this sounds quite different from any country that exists today. While some nations might have elements that are similar to what we've described, no country truly represents all these principles. But here's the point. Even if we don't want to adopt Aristotle's polity wholesale, there are valuable lessons we can learn from it. The importance of balancing different interests in society, the need for an engaged and educated citizenry, the value of thinking long-term in our policy decisions, the polarization, the short-term thinking, the disconnect between the governed and the governing. These are all problems that Aristotle grappled with over 2 millennia ago, but we've really only scratched the surface here. There's so much more to learn about Aristotle's political philosophy and how it relates to our world today. So if you want to dive deeper into Aristotle's ideas, I encourage you to watch our other videos on Aristotle's regime types. Thank you for watching.
All right. So I hope that was informative. Some 2,300-year-old advice from Aristotle. Very interesting. And yeah, we are going to see what happens in 2 days. Yeah. Concerning. All right. Well, we'll see. No one's got anything. We will see you tomorrow. Oh yeah, hey, hang on. I forgot something. I was gonna show something. I forgot. What I did was I asked my chat GPT, what is the minimum wage in the lowest 10 U.S. states? And this is what I got. Georgia, 515. Wyoming, 515. I mean, I can't even begin to fathom anyone that's living on that wage. Anyway, and then I did, what is the lowest 10 minimum wages in Canada? Let me show you here. I was really kind of surprised by the results. I was actually very surprised. Alberta. Interesting. Lowest in Canada. Interesting. But $15 an hour, almost 3 times the lowest U.S. rate. I mean, could be, an argument for cost of living, but really? I don't think so. Yeah. And why would we want to be Americans? I don't know. You tell me. Oof. Boy. Anyway. We will see you tomorrow for some interesting things. Yep. All right. Have a good one. See you tomorrow. Hey, I forgot music. Oh well.